You're probably wondering why I'm sitting here not wearing my usual Star Trek shirt, which I like to wear for these videos. The reason's actually really simple. See, we're going to be doing things a little bit differently this time around, due to the nature of this episode and some backstory behind it. So forgive me for talking a little bit. This is basically going to be kind of a little bit of a then and now situation for this episode. In other words, what I thought about the episode prior to watching it. In other words, I have not watched the episode yet as of this moment that I'm talking. Then I'll watch it, then I'll do the episode as normal, right? But the reason this one prompted this... Okay, a little bit of an explanation. Usually when I'm doing a job that involves, I have to actually do something, involves my interactivity, but is not something that really engages me mentally, I like to have at least one other thing to do at the same period of time. Lord knows I'm probably not the only person like that. So the idea here is, especially for the decade or so I worked as a network engineer, there's a lot of times where I would have television shows playing in the background while I was working so that I could actually keep awake, basically, especially when I first started that third shift, that overnight shift. So I mentioned this to explain one of the reasons why I have watched and rewatched and rewatched so many of my favorite series. I have watched Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, TNG, etc. like 3-4 times through the entire series. And I mentioned that because a lot of people have asked me, why would you ever re-watch Voyager so many times? Well, now you kind of know. The reason for bringing that up, though, is every time I re-watch one of these series, there's what I like to call the skip factor. In other words, certain episodes I just don't watch again. I skip over them on repeat playthroughs of that series. Now, you may be looking at me kind of weird, but there's actually two different reasons for that. One is the obvious, because I hate the episode. Not just don't like, I actively dislike the episode. It's, in my opinion, one of the worst episodes of that particular series, and I don't want to see it. The other reason, and this is a lot more rare, is something about the episode actually bothers me. The best example I could give for this is actually Farscape. I forget the name of the episode, but all I gotta say is the eye thing. Yeah, that bugs the crap out of me. So I actually skipped that episode upon repeat playthroughs. My point, though, is that in Voyager there are only 3 episodes I habitually skip. Only 3, which is quite good, all things considered, for the quality of the series, at least in my opinion. The first is Threshold, which honestly I don't feel like I need to explain why. The second is Alliances, and I really talked about that during my rumination of Alliances. But again, doesn't need a huge amount of explanation. The third one's this episode, Q and the Gray. Here's the thing. For the longest time, and indeed up to now, having not rewatched the episode in some time, and several repeats of this show, my opinion was that Q and the Gray was the second worst episode of Voyager. Not of all of Star Trek, but of Voyager. The only reason it's second worst is because Threshold happens to exist. I hated this episode. But when I was talking to a few of my friends a little over a year ago, actually, who are also Star Trek fans and Voyager fans, I got some surprise from that reaction because they liked this episode. And when a good friend of mine, Pax, actually recently was watching Voyager for the first time, he actually liked Q and the Gray. And so I decided, this time through, obviously I'm watching them all anyways. I mean, I endured Threshold, for God's sakes. But not only would I watch Q and the Gray, but I would try to go in with as much of a neutral opinion as possible and really try to take the episode on its own merits. But before I did that, I wanted to talk about the episode here, which is what I'm doing now. I can explain why I hate Q and the Gray in 2 basic bullet points, okay? Number 1, Q is a horn dog. Now, the thing is, I don't want to explore this in full depth because that would make this episode pretty long, but to suffice it to say, the idea of Q wanting to mate with Janeway is ridiculous for several reasons, not the least of which being the fact that it kind of gets rid of one of the major points of being a Q. Even though the episode itself acknowledges that, my point is they then have the power to do that, and that begs the question of why they never have, cultural implications, etc. Moving along, though. That I could still tolerate, because they did that, if you'll remember, in Death Wish. There's a wonderful scene where Q is just looking right into Jayway's face and talking about her as though she's not even there, and expressing how surprised he is at how fascinating she was. It was wonderfully in character for Q. At no point in time did he lose the superiority of being a superior being, but at the same time it never went over the edge into creepy or excessive or kind of ridiculous or slapstick. It was interesting. So, again, still kind of with that, but the approach they did to this episode is pretty much full on the honeymooners. Q just goes way over the top and just completely flings himself at her with the worst lines imaginable, right? And just, my cosmic clock is ticking is a line in this episode. And I remember that even though I haven't seen this episode in like 5 years. I still remember that damned line. Now, I know what you're going to say if you're a defender of this episode. Well, wait, Archie and Gaia. He could be doing that because that's just his nature, as, you know, his mischievous superiority complex portraying itself, because he is in the action of portraying such a ridiculously, stupidly over-the-top mating ritual. He is making fun of the very concept of mating rituals, to which I say, yeah, that actually makes perfect sense. But then why is he doing that if the situation is as dire as it is? Interesting fact about Q, at least up until now. Anytime the situation actually gets serious or is something he cares about, he will make fun. He will poke, he will mock, but he will never waste time, and he will always ensure that things move in the direction he wants them to. The idea of him basically wasting time with his mockery of a mating ritual kind of falls flat in the face of that, especially given the sheer amount of time. I swear it's like a third of the episode. We'll see on repeat viewing. But it's a decent chunk of the episode is devoted to him just going after Janeway. And, of course, the final point is, even despite the over-the-top performance, I stressed that earlier comment, Q is a horn dog. It doesn't feel like he's actually trying to mate with her or care about her or even trying to do this great thing for the Continuum. It feels like he wants to get in her pants, is the way it was presented. That's not interesting. I'm sorry, at least not to me. But even that, even all of that I could have excused if they did something with it. Which they didn't, because here's the second problem, and the second reason why I should need this. The second reason why I hate this episode. Beeping sounds. Voyager is infamous for basically cutting the balls off of anything that actually had significance or threat within the Star Trek universe. Enterprise actually did this too, to be honest with you, but Voyager was where that trend started. Which is funny, because DS9 kind of did the opposite, but I digress. My point is, though, while what they did to the Borg is kind of unforgivable, and we'll be talking about that as we go through, in my opinion, this episode did such a huge disservice to the Q. Everything about the Q that had been built up into this point, culturally, societally, in terms of their power, in terms of the individuals, was basically thrown out the window by this episode. And it's funny because in a certain way, it kind of could have continued that awesome, amazing thread of potential that was left after Death Wish. Because Death Wish was begging for a sequel. It really was. Death Wish fully delved into the inner workings of the Continuum and actually showed just how culturally and societally and civilizedly stagnant that the Q had actually become. And it was great seeing them like that, because all our previous indications of the Continuum as a culture have been the draconian dictators who mete out laws and judgment upon the lesser races. Seeing them in such a flat and frankly decayed state was not only amazing, but it really shed incredible new light on every other interaction with the Continuum. And then we have this episode where they're at Civil War. Okay, still interested. It would be interesting to see the kind of impact Civil War was having back in the Alpha, Beta quadrants, etc., and the Gamma quadrant for that matter. But no, we can't have inter-series continuity. That's just crazy. But, Q Civil War, okay. And then the Q kind of get pulled down. They get pulled down from a more of an alien race into a more of a human race by this episode, is really what I'm getting at. They have genders, first of all. Now, you may argue that they might not necessarily have genders, they just have romantic entanglements. But the thing is, everything we've seen prior to this point has actually flown in the face of that and has disagreed with that. Also, the how do I put this? The way in which they wage war, again, if I'm willing to actually try and defend this episode, can be explained away by them not wanting to damage reality any more than they have to by using such limited means. But even at that point, even if I'm excusing all of this away, even if I'm trying to hand wave this all away, this is still kind of a net negative here for me. Then we reach the part where the Voyager crew enters the Q continuum by flying into a supernova and then holds up the enemy generals and forces a peace treaty and ends a civil war by defeating the Q. I don't even know how to respond to that. Picard has defeated Q on a few occasions by basically being such a particular type of person that he has refused to play along or acquiesce to his demands or play his game, etc. But never has Picard actually walked up and held a gun to Q's head, or AQ's head for that matter, and therefore won a battle against the Q. Now, I know what you're going to say. Oh, those are Q guns. To which I respond, you know, it doesn't work that way. Nothing about that works that way. A Q gun apparently just has the same basic mechanics of point and shoot and can apparently be utilized by an ordinary human being with no augmentation whatsoever. And can hold at bay, I mean, the very concept of holding someone at gunpoint, even for a human being, is not a guarantee of actually getting them to surrender or defeating them, because there are ways you can get around that. There are quite a few ways. A lot of martial arts, and I remember this back from when I used to do judo a lot, had to do with dealing with being held at gunpoint, because you can deal with that. And that's just from a human perspective. Now add to that the supposedly infinite power of the Q, and it's like, oh, hey. Except they don't have to do the snap, because they can just do stuff instantly if they feel like it, which they have done more than once, by the way. My point is, it did the same thing Voyager does all the time. It took the Q from this to this, which not only retroactively kind of ruined a lot of the Q continuum as a whole, but also retroactively ruined Q himself. And honestly, even John Delancey couldn't salvage this episode for me. John Delancey, one of my favorite actors, who's an amazing guy, could not salvage this episode for me. Wow, you know. I'm done ranting. I'm done ranting. This is all memory, obviously. I'm going to watch the episode, probably not today, in all honesty, because the throat issues really killed my schedule, so I'm cramming everything in. But I'll watch the episode, put on the actual shirt, and then record, and then we'll see what I think. So, see you in a minute. Oh, God. Kill me. Kill me now. Oh, God. Okay, I'm exaggerating. It's not that bad. It wasn't that bad. It wasn't that bad. Just finished watching it. I told you it'd be a different day. I actually did my notes slightly differently this time. I don't know if you can tell here, but I put a little P next to various notes that I felt were positives. There's a long-standing Star Trek theory amongst Star Trek fans that postulates the idea that the Q aren't actually super advanced, super powerful energy beings. Instead, it gives the idea that they're just super advanced beings. Oh. Excuse me, one moment. The idea here being, you know, if a human who was interested in lording their power over another human wanted to do so, they could if they had sufficiently advanced technology. Or to put this really down to earth, you remember the episode in TNG where Ardra, I believe is what she called herself, used a series of, you know, technological manipulations in order to basically pull off parlor tricks in order to make herself seem more powerful than she actually was? That kind of thing has always fascinated me because it's something that's basically never explored within Star Trek. And as a writer, I actually understand why. It boils down to the fact that when you give your characters in a story access to a certain level of advanced either technology, magic, or both, it gets to the point where it's hard to actually make things that are actually threatening or dramatic for them. Because when you start to think about it, it's like, well, why don't they just do ABC? Because they have this level of advanced technology. Now, it's hard to hit that balance point between we're advanced and we're so advanced we can do anything. But my point here, forgive me for segueing, is the idea that the Q, and this is a fan theory I've heard many, many, many times, the Q are just a species that happens to have really advanced technology, past what the Borg have, past what the modern era has, etc., right? Okay, I could kind of see that, in all honesty, and everything that they have done and do could actually fit within that confine. Now, I've never actually bought into that theory personally, but it's hard to deny the fact that Q in the Gray really kind of emphasizes that idea. And probably, if I were actually to sit down and debate if that were true or not, Q in the Gray, if we're to consider it fully continuity, which you shouldn't do in any Star Trek anything, because Star Trek isn't even continuous with itself, but if we were, yeah, I'd say they're just advanced aliens rather than, super beings. Just pointing that out. This episode, I did a little back, research and back development and whatnot into this to try and figure out what went on behind the scenes. I do that every episode, actually. Would you be surprised to learn that I found that most of the people who worked on this episode actually felt it was overall a positive episode? Now, that being said, that is basically limited to the director, Cliff Bole, the writers, plural, we'll get to that in a second, Kate Mulgrew, and John Delancey. That's pretty much all I've heard from. Now, granted, those are pretty much the only ones who actually do anything in this episode. Yeah, I can't quite bring myself to say it, but I mean, while I did enjoy this episode more than I thought I would, this is still a pretty solid net negative for me. Sorry, guys, I tried. I really tried. But my reason for bringing the writing up is this was originally written by Kenneth Biller as a result, intended as a direct sequel to Death Wish. Okay. Now, you may wonder why I say it like that. That's because his original script was over here, and then it was rewritten about 1 billion times, rough approximation, by more than one author. And a lot of page one rewrites, and a lot of re-rewrites, and a lot of re-rewrites. To give you an idea of how much this episode was rewritten, the final script that actually was going to be performed was handed to John Delancey literally right before he walked onto the stage in order to start performing it. Now, that can work sometimes, and has worked in the past, but spoiler alert, or whatever, when it comes to television, even modern television, but especially television when Voyager was coming out, when a script has been processed that much, generally that's what we call a bad sign. And in general, the reason a script like that even gets onto the screen is because of the fact that they have a schedule to keep, right? An episode has to go live every week, for every period of time, and they don't obviously record it every week. It's more like they do a giant chunk of recording over the course of several months for all the episodes that are going to be edited and processed for that entire year. But the point is, they needed an episode, they needed to start recording, they had a schedule, so they couldn't just abandon the script. So what I'm saying here is when you do that kind of a processing to a script, there's only two reasons for that. And one is incredibly unlikely. In fact, I actually can only think of one example of the first example here off the top of my head, and that is Troubles and Tribulations. That's it. I had to think about the episode name. In other words, that episode was written and rewritten several times by a large group of writers because everyone wanted to put buy-in and really wanted to help craft it into a story. The other 99% of the time when you have a situation like this, it's because the script just isn't working, and that problem I mentioned earlier with them having a schedule to keep is why they can't just abandon the script. But the fact that they're rewriting it so much is indicative of the fact that they want to abandon the script, and but they need to make it something serviceable because they have to start recording in like 3 days. You get where I'm going with this. And forgive me for hammering in on this, but it really shows. The dialogue in this episode, I'm sorry, is terrible. It is absolutely terrible. There are a few gems, don't mistake, but most of the dialogue is very wooden and very unnatural and very inconsistent and has this sort of feeling of awkwardness to it. I mean, I could point to a dozen examples, but my favorite is right in the opening spot where the Doctor actually dumps incredibly meaningless, pointless exposition onto the crew for no reason other than the fact that, excuse me, that they needed more lines for that scene. And you could just see Robert Picardo's face, because that's his only line in the entire episode. And you could just see him, like, trying. And that's the next point I want to make. I want to give some credit to the actors. But one of the funny things is you can actually tell how bad a script is if you're analyzing the performance by the way an actor performs it. A good director and a good actor can pull a good performance out of a bad script. But I stress that word can, not does. And this is a good example of a script that couldn't be salvaged, because the acting on display is actually pretty decent. And the directing, it's Cliff Bole, like I said. For those of you who don't know, he did Best of Both Worlds, just to name one example. He's done a lot of good stuff. He's a good director. So there's some good direction in this episode, and there's some good acting in this episode. But you can actually tell that they're trying to get a good performance out of bad lines. I'd give you a really extreme example, and it's from an esoteric video game most people have not even heard of. I am the President of the United States. But the point is, there's certain types of scripts that cannot be salvaged, and this was one of them. And I'm just going to go ahead and mark that as my first big reason why I still didn't like this episode, because I was basically enduring the dialogue rather than enjoying it, if you follow me. Now, one of the other things that's interesting, some of you may not be aware of this, John Delancey and Kate Mulgrew were friends prior to this, and became stronger friends during the Voyager's run, and are still friends, from my understanding. So the two of them have actually really good chemistry, and in actual fact, it's such a shame about the line problem I just mentioned. But to prove my point, and I honestly encourage you, any of you out there who have the ability to rewatch this episode, do what I did. And I'm honestly curious if you have the same result I did. Because I get so many different opinions from you guys who actually watch these episodes. And it's always fascinating to listen to. One of my most common viewers, for example, really disagrees with me on the Prime Directive. But, you know, it's never an argument. He has his own view and I have my view. And it's always fascinating hearing his different views. So please share with me. But what I did was during the big scene, which is, it's basically the second scene of the episode, where Janeway goes to her quarters and then Q and her banter and, you know, horn dog, etc., right? But, I watched that scene, and I was surprised because the body language and the movement and the directing and all that, it was actually really good, because John and Mulgrew actually have really good chemistry together. But then I, just out of curiosity, and this is what I want you guys to do, I rewatched the scene on mute, because the lines were killing it. The whole time I felt like groaning, and I'm like, ugh. I watched it on mute, and I was like, yeah, okay, that's a lot better. And I mean, I'm trying really hard not to bash this episode, but it's just, this is what happens in television. This is why even great shows, my favorite show of all time, Babylon 5, has episodes like this, where the script just didn't work. And you can't salvage a really bad script, okay? It is possible to salvage a bad script. It's been done many times. But a really bad script like this one, you just can't work with it. And the best you can do is put on your best performance, go out there on stage, and try your damnedest. And I just want to give props to the actors and the directors and even the editors involved in this episode. Some good special effects went into this one, too. They all did a good job. They just could not salvage this terrible, terrible script. Speaking of which, I know that for a while there was a great deal of consideration about a relationship between Chakotay and Janeway, which was basically... I'll talk into this more later. I keep saying that there's so many things I have to talk about when we get to Scorpion. It's another overhaul of the series, basically, similar to Way of the Warrior, for a good example. But there was a very strong intention on the writer's staff, specifically, to go ahead and ship Chakotay and Janeway. And a lot of fans were interested in that idea as well. But it never actually surfaced, partially because the two actors felt that it wouldn't work, partially because they were hesitant about basically having Janeway have a relationship at all because she's female, and that would show how weak she is because she's a female captain rather than a captain who happens to be female. I've talked about this before. Moving on. Point being, this episode took that and tried to go ahead and treat it as if that was actually true for the sake of a cheap joke. Or to phrase this a little bit more literally, if you have not seen this episode, Chakotay, I can't even believe I'm saying this, Chakotay acts jealous of Q. That's stupid on so many levels, I don't even feel like ripping it apart, so we're just going to leave that alone. But I have to mention the joke that it was made, because I have heard exactly one person ever, and again, I'm interested in differing opinions, or at least your opinions, honest opinions. You know, it doesn't have to be different. I've heard one person who actually found the joke funny, ever. It's a mine's bigger joke. Oh my god. Q asks if Janeway likes Chakotay because of the tattoo, does a jump cut and a whirl, and then says, because mine's bigger. And then Janeway, of course, says, not big enough. Not going to comment any further. Now, let's talk about a positive. I have a little P next to this point. One of the things I like about Q's attitude towards trying to get Janeway to mate with him is he is approaching it like, well, to be a little bit blunt, like I've seen several actual human beings approach it, aka love, marriage, romance, relationships, commitment. All of that is just a vehicle for procreation. I have actually heard many people say that the biological imperative, and by the way, no bile here, no error, no vile. My tone's still a little irritable because of the episode. Don't forgive me, okay? But I've heard many people say that the biological imperative is the only thing that actually matters when it comes to all aspects of such human existence, when it comes to the softer, grayer areas of ill-defined human nature. Now, I disagree with that violently, but I have heard that argument, and I've heard many people put pretty strong arguments for why. And so his approach throughout the whole episode, he never says it outright, which is good, actually. But he is always approaching it as if human beings know how to procreate, and in order to get to them procreate, I have to purchase the right to procreate, because that's how humans, I shouldn't say humans, that's how mortals, that's how, sexually reproducing beings work, right? And it's actually really appropriate and in keeping with Q's theory. I mentioned before the idea that he was just wasting time when the stakes were so high, and I still think that. But at least he's doing it because he is genuinely ignorant of the subject and so incapable of adapting and inflexible in his thinking that it never occurs to him that she might not be interested in him emotionally. In terms or mentally, that she might simply be, that kind of a relationship that would be required for that kind of copulation to happen would be such a time investment, whereas he just wants to literally say, "Here, I will purchase your affection," kind of literally. And I don't want to pull this into a whole money for sex kind of thing, because that's not the point. The point is, from his perspective, mortal beings procreate, but he has no idea how to get there. That's really what I mean by this. He is not treating her as if she's property. He's treating her as if he has no idea what he's doing. And I like that. I like the fact that he has a total lack of comprehension of the softer, gray areas of human nature, like I said. So that was awesome. I also find it interesting that he never actually is upfront with the truth until they're actually in the continuum. Now, from a writing perspective, that's for obvious reason. You want to save a reveal until it has its biggest impact. But from an in-character perspective, it's also fascinating because why? Why would Q not just upfront and say, Catherine Janeway, I want to have a child with you for the purposes of trying to insert new blood into the continuum in order to stop a civil war. Why does he never say that? Now, I have almost no doubt that this is me reading too much into it in a sense that it was never intended to be subtle, but at the same time, John Delancey's performance does give some hints of this. So, in my opinion, it's because Q never actually wanted to face the reality of the consequences of the situation he created. the kind of a person who would start a civil war without any idea of what a civil war means, and then just want to end it as quickly as possible, and not even acknowledge that it was there. And being forced to face it is probably the closest thing to an actual thematic plotline this episode really has, is being faced to force the consequences of one's actions. In fact, they say that, I believe, at least twice directly in the episode. So I just find that to be an interesting character study of Q that was probably not intended. So Susie Plaxon, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, because I actually like her as an actress. She played Dr. Seelar back in TNG. She also played Keeler. God, it's been a long time since I've watched her episodes. Worf's mate, the mother of Alexander. Worf's first mate. Not Jadzia. The reason I bring her up is I've liked her a lot in all her previous roles. She's also on Enterprise as, I don't remember her name, she's an Andorian. She does some good work, and I actually like her, which is why it feels really bad, because I hate her performance in this episode. But that being said, I find myself wondering if this is me reading too much into it, or if this is the director and the actors trying to make a subtlety where the script had none. Because it could go either way, especially with, again, talented actor, talented director. So from her, we get the second perspective of the continuum that we have in this episode specifically. We already have Q, lack of willing to face consequences, and of course the impish rogue kind of a thing, but he's always had a degree of charm and charisma to him, which, to be totally blunt, I attribute to John Delancey's acting. And if you don't believe me, watch the first 2 episodes Q is in back in TNG, and remind me again why it is that Q actually became a character. I'll go ahead and tell you the answer right now and save you the time. It's because John frickin' Delancey actually nailed the role, and it wasn't until Q Who that Q actually was acting like Q for the first time, but I digress. The point being, though, her portrayal of Susie Q was really irritating in its over-the-top arrogance and superiority and smugness and condescension, right? And yet, I feel like that was dialed up to 11, again, on the part of the director and the actor, deliberately to emphasize the state of the Q Continuum's culture, the way their society had been going, the way they had been stagnating. I'll be talking about this more later. But I feel this was the first thing that really got me thinking about that. The idea that the Q are so mired in their own superiority, which is factual, that they don't bother to think about it anymore. Or to use, I hate to reference an anime, but to reference something that happened in Bleach, a certain villain who I shall not name for fear of spoilers for some people who haven't seen the series yet, used his brain extensively. Very much was skilled, very much was careful, very cautious, constantly manipulating things perfectly so things would go well, until it reached the point where he was so powerful he didn't have to bother anymore. And so he didn't. He stopped bothering to try anymore. And he just used his overwhelming power to just win outright. I feel like a similar situation has happened to the Q as a culture over the insert period of time here, because we have these people who are so ridiculously powerful, and yet they are actually bested mentally and in terms of strategy and tactics by humans. Because humans are by their nature creatures who have to adapt constantly, because that's our only real strong point. I mean, if you think about it, human beings, the human body is a brilliantly designed machine, don't mistake me, but when it comes down to it, and in terms of comparison to, everything else just on our own planet, we are very down on the chain. But this right here is why we're winning, and probably will continue to be. We think. We are weak, and therefore we have to be skilled. We have to adapt. We have to learn. We have to function. We can't sit on our laurels and use our power as a crutch, like the Q are, you see? So, and it also makes it interesting, too, because so much of what the Q do throughout the Q series is very blunt, very brute force. They don't do things, forgive me for putting it bluntly, cleverly. Now, there are a few exceptions, most of them from Q himself, but for the most part, the Q as a whole just use raw brute force and go in their approach. So it makes sense to me. That being said, one of the things I like, and I'll talk about that point in a minute, but I want to get back to my notes here. I like the line, "The continuum is burning." That line actually gave me just a tiny bit of a chill, mostly the way he delivered it. but also the very concept of the Q continuum, something has been referenced all the way back to Encounter at Farpoint. At least I think it was mentioned there. But something we've known for forever as far as Star Trek fans go. The idea of the continuum being on fire just has an impact to it, and that was really well done and really well performed. I also like the concept that Q himself, John Delancey, was always someone who believed in the concept of stretching. Mentally, emotionally, for his own amusement, whatever. I'm not going to call him a good person, let's make that clear. Even though I do think he has good qualities, and I mean that sincerely. That's my opinion. Tapestry and All Good Things both really emphasize that point, in my opinion. But the idea here is that he is someone who has been trying in his own minuscule way to actually use his head. And the rest of the Q continuum has been content to lay stagnant in their power, right? Now, granted, Q himself still has shades of that, but he's the only one trying at all. But the reason I like this, the implied reason that he's never been able to actually do anything about it up until now is no other Q have been on his side. I know that you might look at the math and say that one infinity versus two infinities is irrelevant because they're both infinity, right? But the concept is basically that. The idea that one infinity versus two infinities, the two infinities win. And so Q has always been able to be pushed down by the overall raw power of the rest of the continuum. But now that he has other Qs on his side, they can now push back, which is why they're actually capable of rebelling against the status quo at all. So another good point in the episode's favor. I also... How do I say this? I'm going to quote a direct quote here, if you'll forgive me. War can be an engine of change. War can transform a society for the better. There is no easy way to say this. War is a terrible thing, okay? Real life, real horrible war is horrible. But Q is correct. Many, many times in our own human history, wars have left society or culture or progress or technology or whatever for the better. Now that is not... Now it's funny that you think about this, because this is the ultimate quandary if you really consider it. This is a quagmire right here. War causes those kind of changes because war is such a violent and immediate thing that society and people and technology and culture and all that fun stuff have to change now, because now is what war basically is in its most horrible form, right? But then the reason it's a quagmire is because war isn't actually necessary, nor indeed is war what is causing that. The war, if only we could have just set periods of time where it's like, we hit a button, it's like, all right, societal change, go! Or, oh, let's have a technological revolution and start dumping money into research and development. Because that's what war is causing, but those are byproducts of war. Those are things that are basically only happening because of the nature of what war is. So war is a truly terrible thing, but good things can come out of it. But that's basically a lemonade out of lemons kind of situation in a very extreme fashion. And it still comes with such horrible cost that most people agree that artificially starting a war just to force that kind of thing to happen is what we would call a bad thing. I mention this here especially because this goes back to what I was talking about and what I've been weaving here this entire time. The idea that the Q don't get it. The whole of the Q continuum and Q himself do not understand. They have the textbook in front of them that tells them the raw data, the information, but they have no comprehension of it. Q himself couldn't comprehend the idea of trying to approach Janeway slowly, gradually over time, trying to get closer to her, trying to actually become emotionally attached to her. All the things that we people and people in Star Trek have been doing for forever in order to actually have a relationship with someone. Slowly working away, becoming friends, actually caring about them, showing your care about them, and all that never occurred to him because he had the textbook of data in front of him and had no idea what it was telling him. Didn't get it at all. It was just raw information. Susie Q has this whole thing where she's trying to make people, do what they have to do and accomplish these goals, and she constantly acts like they don't understand what she's trying to do, because of course they don't. They're just bipedal biological creatures and ugly sacks of mostly water, right? And yet at the same time, she obviously has no comprehension of the fact that they not only get it, but they probably get it better than she does. I find myself wondering if she doesn't even fully understand the full significant effects of what this war means and why. In fact, I'm not even sure anyone of the Q actually understand the full ramifications of a Q war. Because think about what war does to us mere mortals. And think about beings like that, whether they're advanced energy beings, advanced technological beings, or super powerful energy beings. It doesn't matter. Or to put this down a step, imagine a species that is actually weaker than the Q, the Borg, and imagine the Borg having a civil war. And tell me just how devastating that would be as entire swaths of sectors are absorbed to be used as war fodder. Think about it. I have a little note here because this is my biggest point right here. I find it interesting that Q's biggest idea is the concept of introducing new blood into the continuum. I find myself wondering if the resolution of the episode is actually realistic or not. Don't look at me like that. You know what I mean. The point being, would the Confederate side, I'll talk about that later, actually be willing to accept a truce just because there is a newborn Q? Granted, I get the concept. I really do. And Q's idea is fascinating. The concept of literally doing something that's never been done before because it's never been done before. For the purpose of doing something new. For the purpose of trying to change. Because the change itself, just like war, is not the part that actually matters when it comes to what happens after. It is the results of that change, the results of that war, that cause a society to grow, that cause a culture to form, that cause a civilization to bloom. War and change both can be very terrible things, but both can also lead to incredible leaps forward in societal evolution. And I find myself wondering if Q accidentally happened across the idea of change, of doing something so violently, suddenly upheavaled as a change, just because it was what he figured would be the quick and easy answer, without realizing that he was fully right, because what he was doing was basically counteracting the one change, the war, with another change, the birth of a new Q. And that these two forces would then cancel each other out. But at the same time, because things are now different, because of both the war and the new Q, now the Q continuum can move on and try to become a new and better society. I'm probably giving this episode way too much credit. Couple more notes. These are all negatives. You know what? I'm not even going to say anything. This whole thing is a metaphor. Gets stretched to the point of ludicrousity. Yes, I just made up that word to describe how stupid it is that human beings can untie omnipotent beings from bandages that are apparently made by other omnipotent beings, and also you can have a freaking bandage sling for an injured arm of another omnipotent being, even though he doesn't actually have an arm made of bandages, and then the bullets. I mean, I know you keep saying it's metaphor, but it's so stretched in this episode, it loses all cohesion. And it's dumb. I'm just gonna say it. It's dumb. It kills me watching that. And then the Voyager flies into a supernova in order to go into the Q continuum by using technobabble. Okay, I'm done. God, my nose. Okay, I'm done. I swear. I do like Chakotay's scene with Suzy Q. He is just as forceful and as strong as he needs to be when he approaches her and he confronts her about the fact that she's no longer, capable of using her powers. But at the same time, he never goes over the top with it. He never reaches the point where he feels like he's bullying her or he is actually abusing or hurting her. It's just as forceful as it should be. And in fact, if I could be so blunt, the scene caught my eye, and actually rewound to watch the scene again because something about it caught me. Something about it really resonated with me, and I figured out what it was on second viewing. Chakotay was acting like a military officer there, properly. And it just was like, oh, wow, Chakotay actually has some balls. Holy crap. It was great. I loved it. If only we could have more of that. Another good thing is John Delancey has a line that says, that hurts. That's another line that I had to rewind and reanalyze because he says it with the exact amount of subtlety that is required. He doesn't say, oh, that hurts, or that hurts? You know, that would be too obvious. And forgive me because I cannot emulate the way he does it. I'm not as good of an actor as anybody is. I'm the worst actor in the world. But the point being, John Delancey does it with the perfect level of confusion and yet understanding. The idea of realizing that he has been injured, that he is feeling what a Q comprehends as pain as a result of this injury. Very nice touch. Just felt like saying that. I kind of already talked about that, so we'll just skip ahead here. I'm not going to talk about the implications of the choice that is offered Janeway. I'm also not going to talk about the fact that Janeway comes across as a little bit too much of a hippie in this episode. I'm just going to say it like that, with all negative connotations intended towards Janeway, not towards hippies. My own mother was a hippie. What do you want from me? Point being, though, that she, as a military captain, should understand everything that I just said about war and the concept of what it is, and understand just how terrible that is. But I mean, I feel like pointing out how many Starfleet officers over in Deep Space Nine and TNG were willing and chomping at the bait in order to sign up, in order to fight in the fights that they come across, not because they wanted to fight, not because of bloodlust, but because they believed in whatever it was that they cared about, because they wanted to make a difference and help end that war. And they knew that fighting was the best way to accomplish that. They knew that, you know, possibly giving their lives was what they could do in order to help benefit the situation positively. As opposed to Janeway, who constantly comes across as someone who's running onto the middle of a battlefield, waving flowers around at people. I'm done. So okay, I got 3 more points to look at. Sorry, I'm refreshing myself on my notes here. God, I have terrible handwriting. Refreshing myself in the notes. I have to point out that I mentioned earlier the Confederate thing. For those of you not aware, the side of the Q Civil War that is involved with maintaining the draconian status quo are the ones who are wearing the Confederate uniforms, and Q's side of championing individuality and change are the ones wearing the Union side. I could analyze that. I could try and read too much into it, but I guarantee you I would be reading too much into it in this case, because it was done because in the average viewer's mind, the Union were the good guys and the Confederate were the bad guys, at least at the time. And so that's why they were done that way, and for no other reason. I'm not even going to bother. Now, 2 last points before I'm actually done. I've always gotten the strong impression, especially with the Q episodes in Voyager, but this is true in TNG as well, that the Q have always been playing a form of chess game with the Borg. And I really like the concept that the only reason, this is a theory that I've heard many times, and I actually agree with it personally, the only reason the Borg haven't just swept across everywhere and already won is because the Q are holding their leash, so to speak. Artificially retarding their progress, their development, what they could target, when they could target, and literally slowing them down. Because if you think about it, the Borg going full tilt, which logically they have no reason not to go full tilt, would have already swept across the entire Milky Way galaxy and then moved on for seconds by now. But they haven't. They're they're completely contained in one chunk of one quadrant. They're basically in what I'd refer to as a region in Star Wars terms, and that's it. Why? So the fact that the Q might be holding them back makes tons of sense, especially given how often the Qs and the Borg storyline kind of interweave. And the idea that the Q might actually be a little bit afraid of the Borg. Not right now, of course, but whether they're the energy beings or whether they're the advanced beings, and this is another point of evidence people usually use to say that they're just advanced beings with technology, the idea that the Borg could threaten the Q long-term if they're not dealt with in a long-term fashion kind of makes sense when you think about it. At what point do the Borg stop adapting, you know? At what point does their technology not allow them to access things that otherwise they shouldn't? And forgive me for using something that's ridiculous as a point in favor of this, but the Voyager crew managed to defeat... God, I can't even believe I'm saying this. Defeat Q's with their own technology, with their own weapons. What's stopping the Borg from analyzing those weapons, replicating those weapons, adapting all their technology to that level of advancement? You get where I'm going with this. Now, you could also say, well, then why don't the Borg just... I can't do it right now. Q-snap all the Borg... Or why don't the Q just Q-snap all the Borg away? One of the other things that's been analyzed a lot by people who are total geeks like myself is the idea that the Q don't like to do sweeping changes like that to societies for two big reasons. One, because cultural stagnation, etc. I already talked about that. And two, because they believe, probably rightly, in their own form of the Prime Directive. The idea that if you're going to violently change a society or a galactic level of cosmic consequence, you don't just do it. You do it gradually, or you do it not at all. It's also worth noting that Q himself is pretty much the only one that we ever see directly interfering with what the Borg are doing. Which also kind of goes in with that theory I just mentioned, that the Q as a whole are so well-versed, stagnant, confident in their own superiority that they think that they are at the point where they think of the Borg just like they do anyone else, and it is Q himself who recognizes that the Borg could be a threat, which is part of the reason why he throws the Federation and the Alpha and Beta Quadrants in their path, which is part of the reason why, and this brings me to my final point, that Q deliberately, if you pay attention to the 3Q episodes in Voyager, Q never actually sends them home to Earth, even though the opportunity has arisen for him to do so at least twice. Why? I can't. This is totally me reading too much into this, and I freely admit this, but I like this idea enough that I wanted to share it with you guys. I like the idea that Q, our Q, John Delancey, does things, subtle things, quiet things, along with the Voyager crew, specifically to neuter the Borg in the ways that they are actually, deballed throughout the course of Voyager as a run, so that the Borg will never actually become that kind of overarching threat in the future to the Continuum or indeed to anyone else he actually cares about. And that would explain why he never actually sends them home to Earth, because if he did, that wouldn't happen. All those encounters with the Borg, including the last one where they finally go home, all happen in the Delta Quadrant. So you see where I'm going. They see where the threads kind of tie together neatly, even though that doesn't actually make sense when you really analyze it. And of course, again, it's me reading too much into it. I feel like I had one other thing to talk about, but ultimately it was just rehashing, so I guess we're done there. We'll go ahead and cut it off. I've probably talked for way too long anyways. I feel like this is a long episode. I will see you on the next one.
You believe human DNA is going to restore peace?
Precisely. What the Continuum needs right now is an infusion of fresh blood, a new sensibility, a new leader, a new messiah. Think of it, Kathy. Our child will be like a precious stone tossed into the cosmic lake, sending endless ripples of human conscience and compassion to wash up on every distant shore of the universe. What greater contribution could a being of your limited power ever hope to make?